Go. So thank you very much, first and foremost. Nice to be in a slightly different forum to what I'm used to, in all honesty.
Awesome. Okay, so let's begin.
Let's begin, okay. So yeah, indeed, thank you again for having me. It's wonderful to be in a different audience to what I'm used to. Usually outcomes researchers, health economists, policy analysts are my usual gig. But none of the analysis really happens without data standards. None of the academic work happens without, well, this audience, frankly. So I want to thank Rachel Dunscombe for the invitation. And we've got just some time, 20 minutes, hopefully time for some questions or really reflections on this to talk about the value of data. So a bit of background to me. I've sort of given you my usual audience. And my academic positions at the Department of Health Policy at the LSE. I'm an executive director at one of our health economics exec MSCs. You may be interested in that because what we're talking about today links to that program and the discussions we have on value as a fundamental concept for economists. So I should mention that. In my research in the past, I've looked at the value of incident reporting systems in the NHS, which if you're a clinician, you'll know a lot about. If you're an informatician, you'll know even more about and may have some concerns about those systems and their functioning as an information system. Well, about a decade ago, I spent some time trying to work out what the value of those systems are to the NHS. So in some sense, that links to this presentation. And in addition to that, and really what led from that work and that inquiry was involvement in the NHS Digital Academy. So I was invited in 2017 to initiate the first module for the NHS Digital Academy, and I think we have about 700 or 800 plus informaticians that have been trained through that program now. So I've been involved in that. So by way of background, talking about the value of data in the context of systems, they're my credentials, but do I think for a minute that I've got all the answers? No. And I can kind of summarize that position with the first slide for this presentation, where Rachel and I talked about this title, the value of data. I said, yeah, absolutely, we talk about that all the time, it's important. And I thought, okay, then I thought. And this slide seemed to be the appropriate place to start. Where to start was the question. It's so fundamental to what we're doing, but how do you dissect that question? What do I talk to you about in 20 minutes? Was something that I've been puzzling over leading up to this moment. So by no means do I have the answers, but I think what we have to come back to, especially in recent health economic thinking, is how to think. What principles should we be going by? So I'm really going to try and direct the focus of these 20 minutes towards some principles, some concepts, albeit we can look at things technically and with a degree of mathematics attached to them, because that's implied as part of the job description as an economist. We've got to think mathematically and technically. And so where to start? Data equals value. So what's the value of data? Well, let's just assume that data equals value. Data equals value might be another way of putting that. And really, there's something of a functional relationship between data and value. It's not that it automatically equals value. This seems to be the first essential place to start, that it's contingent as a functional relationship between data and value that we have to acknowledge and be clearer about, especially in a world that's getting exabytes more data to wrangle and deal with. So I'm preaching to the choir on that aspect. But for me, there's this implicitly, it's a good place to start, saying data equals value, is that really the case? Let's question that, let's interrogate that a little bit. Say, well, actually, it's dependent on some contingencies. So the next thing I thought is, well, let's ask the question, but equally, let's give the answer to this presentation so that you're not left, well, on tenterhooks wondering what's the value of data? Well, here's the answer, per patient record. That was easy. So I can finish now. But actually, it's because I think from the, let's say, targeted review of the literature that I did to get up to speed on this topic for this presentation, it seemed like actually that's about the extent of the value of data as a summary that we have. 50 to 1,500 pounds per patient record, 50 pounds to 100 pounds for the record itself in an NHS record, just to do the daily service delivery. Then if you consider genomic data, the phenome, and the applications of that, the utility of that, the value of that, then it could be as high as 1,500. And so in the targeted review that I've done, just to spare you some time, 50 to 1,500 seems like a reasonable place to start. If you want to know what the value of data, based on that, that's the range. And that comes from different sources. It comes from consulting firms. So you may have read EY's report on this in 2018. I'm borrowing from that. The government, the Treasury in the UK, has also looked at this and said, well, what's the value of our knowledge assets? And it's a slightly different answer to what we have here, but there's a smattering of public and private entities that are increasingly trying to get to an estimate of the value of the data. And given that it's, in my estimation, chaotic, unclear, I think that's the rationale for looking into, well, the guiding principles as opposed to the actual number, the actual range. This is interesting. It says that it has some value, but what's more interesting is to look at how data creates that value. And I think for us as a group who are interested in data, preoccupied daily with a need for motivation to keep going in a chaotic space, it's best to get under the hood a little bit more. Don't just accept these estimates from various sources where the methods aren't particularly transparent, and that this talks to a conclusion of this presentation, which is that we're only just beginning. That was a terrible error. Sorry. Go away. Unless that's my wife. I didn't say that. So sorry about that. Do excuse me. It was my wife, not you. So data. How does it turn into value? How does it transform into value? Well, data to value could be this simple linear transformation. But actually, let's just go back to first principles. So to get under the hood, we have to be preoccupied in this chaotic world with some fundamentals or first principles. And we know, and you probably have it in your lexicon or your thought process, that data is actually nothing until it becomes information. And that for an economist, we sort of reach for a production possibilities frontier where there's a capital asset or a capital good that's transformed into a consumer good. And the way that these goods are transformed is actually synonymous with data transforming into information. Like data is your raw material. The consumer good is your information. And so that's the first sort of conceptual place to think about data as having value, because it links to value directly. So really these first principles are not new, and I thought it was just valuable to say, well, to think about the value of data, let's think about the examples from the past who've made it pretty clear that there's a value to data. And I've taken some UK-centric examples. So Isaac Newton, he was able to look at data, intangible, in his sphere, around his environment, his ecosystem, and channel it into some fundamental laws of physics by observation. So there's something in transforming an observation, the intangibles, into information that has value centuries later, and that value is continuing. So we've got some pretty clear examples in the past. Another example, roughly chronologically in order, is James Lind. James Lind, the physician who intervened in shipping and with sailors, mitigating the effects of scurvy by putting citrus fruits on ships, recognizing, and performing a trial, by the way, but recognizing that scurvy might have been caused by a lack of vitamin C, and therefore he had some sort of latent, intangible data that he was transforming into information, making a discovery that had value, health. reduced incidence of scurvy in sailors at that time. Still, the premise for a clinical trial, which generates a huge amount of data for us and information for us today, was rooted in his initial observations. Florence Nightingale, another great example, observing the conditions in which infections were proliferated in a ward, and then documenting them, curating the data for the first time to establish some major standards for nursing that endure today. And then briefly, Alexander Fleming, someone who had the nous to realize or observe carefully a Petri dish that led to the scale-up of penicillin. The value of what I'm trying to convey is that the value of the data was in curating it into some information in all of these cases. So the principle holds. These are simple scientific principles that we have to come back to. And I think that talks to what your occupation is, your preoccupation is, as openEHR is preoccupied with curating and structuring data. The history of science, social and natural sciences, is littered with these amazing examples. And it's all based on having some latent ideas in the air. This is how I think about data. It's in the air. There are observations all around us. I think of Noel Gallagher. He says there are just songs that are in the air, in the sky, and they fall down. It's for me to grab them and write them. He just thinks they're everywhere. I quite like that because it's synonymous with this idea that the information is, well, the data is everywhere. Our job is to try to curate it and produce information. It's all about the production of information. And so it sort of emerges as dots in the air. This is deliberately just trying to say it's more data points emerge over time, or these data points become clearer over time, they become sharper for us. And so the value in data is inherent in these observations being made, this data being captured, and us pausing and taking the time to transform it into meaningful information. And what you do, and what the value of that data is contingent on, it is taking all those observations, however they come, bit by bit, or even over time more clear to us, and curating them. It's putting some order to it. It's dealing with the fundamental challenge for all of us as scientists, which is entropy. The universe tends to entropy. Everything has a tendency towards randomness. And the value in data is to take that randomness and curate it, put it in a structure. And increasingly, the structure allows us to get to some of these 3 V's from Gartner. It's the idea of variety of data that's structured and curated. It's the volume of data structured and curated, and ideally the velocity of it. High-speed data, more data points. So this is how I think about data, that it is all around us, and it's for us to try to grab it, curate it, because that's a prerequisite to value. And we don't really understand this process. I have a long-term vision in mind for the value of data, which is we might one day understand this as a really clear production process, and it might be built on these principles. And Gartner made an important clarification when they talked about their 3 V's. They said, well, the 3 V's should not be conflated with the 5 V's, which included veracity and value in the end. You may know this. And they said that because actually value in their 5 V's was contingent on the first 3 V's being in place. So it's echoing my key point, how to think about the value of data. Well, it's contingent on having high volume, structured data that is has veracity and is high volume. So some takeaways. Let's just pause for a minute. Value is created. It's a perpetual exercise in reducing entropy. You're all based in information and communication, so this is very much about, or codified in, the theory of communication by Claude Shannon, 1948, theory of communication, that information or data that is informative has reduced entropy. The first measure you make of a random phenomenon is the highest value measurement. Because before, the possibility for randomness was infinite. And the principle of the theory of communication by Shannon, which is the bedrock of computer science and several other techniques, mathematical and technologies, is that the first measure you make puts a bound on that information. So going from infinity to a bound, making that first observation, be you Newton, Nightingale, Sam'l, and why not, is you had the biggest leap in value that was possible, moving from infinite to a bound. So this perpetual exercise in reducing entropy is what we're engaged in to create value. We require structure to create a bound and the conditions for information production. Information, we could say, is actually synonymous with value, and we're going to extend this. We say synonymous with innovation. It's the information that drives products, processes, and maybe new policies that are the intermediate or intermediary to value creation in economies. And the valuation of intangible data assets in private and public sectors is growing, which reflects this recognition of this value chain from data to information to innovation and value. So we're only just, again, in the last 5 to 10 years, in my estimation, and as bears out in the literature, recognizing the value of that data. It's exciting to me to imagine what we might look at, or how we might look at that in 50 to 100 years. So, just to come back to innovation. This is not the value of innovation is not a new thing to be talking about. But the value of information that drives innovation comes in the pharmaceutical sector and life science sector on a routine basis. So typically, we talk about public investment and private investment in R&D, in innovation, which for a pharmaceutical product is a great example where we can take these concepts and say we see it on a regular basis with clinical trials that can cost $50,000 per patient for a phase 3 trial, that generate information and innovation that has a market return or market approval return to a firm, but also social value. So we have some very clear examples of where this concept of the value chain of data can be isolated, it can be studied, and these concepts are very real, but we're still pretty primitive with it and narrow about how we look at this. So with that, I wanted to try to put in context, again, these principles with an example. So I'm part of an EU consortium. This is an EU Horizon project called Hypermarker, which for me demonstrates the value of data in a very real way, demonstrates the value chain of data in a very meaningful way. Hypermarker is exploiting biobank data in the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany to optimize the prescription of antihypertensives for uncontrolled hypertensives in the population. So hypertension costs health systems 30% of their expenditure is the broad estimate for the European Union. And we don't have very well standardized treatments. We have no new drugs. And if we did have a new drug, it's likely that it would cost us $2.8 billion. That's the estimate that we just saw on the previous slide. By exploiting biobank data that's been carefully curated and structured, for example, the UK Biobank since 2006, the promise is that a highly idiosyncratic prescription of antihypertensives will be optimized using biobank data, using machine learning techniques, and a new decision support system that we will trial next year, and that will produce value. It will produce value that we measure as part of our agreement with this consortium. We don't know how much value, but it's a great example of where over 20 years of biobank data is now structured in a way that we can exploit it in these exciting ways when the alternative is a $2.6 to $8 billion investment in a new pharmaceutical that hasn't happened for hypertension. So again, these concepts are very real, and we have examples, and this is it, all we can really lean on. But we can just say that in our value chain, data And the value of data is in creating information that leads to innovations that could be products, historically pharmaceuticals, but more recently, decision support systems fed by machine learning techniques that are feeding off structured data, and they create value. Now, there's just a few more points I want to make as I begin to close. The value of something depends on us measuring it, evaluating it. And that's where we come in as economists, as you can imagine. And whereas it's a prerequisite that we have structured data to produce the information that produces the innovations, how we perceive the value is a whole other category, and how we measure it is a whole other category for discussion. I have to mention this because this is a really exciting and evolving area in the space. It's in some ways more fundamental than what the consulting groups are doing to value the data for private equity firms or investments by private equity firms or the government. The way we are measuring value is evolving, and you can see it's not just about qualities anymore. This is from the Value Flower by Lakdawala and colleagues at the University of Southern California. Health economists have been challenged to look at the value of innovative interventions across many other dimensions, not just qualities, quality-adjusted life years, not just net costs. Value is so much more than that. It's around productivity to the economy. It's around benefits to family members, not just the patient. And we don't routinely capture these items. You might be surprised. We focus on qualities and the patient for the most part. But what's recently been proposed is that we should be looking at the value of innovations and the information that fed them on the basis of real option value. For example, can we capture the value of an innovation because it extended the life of a patient, which meant they were on the planet for longer, which gave them more options for treatment? That's called real option value. How do we capture that? How do we measure value in that way? There are more things to say, but I wanted to give you a flavor of how we're looking at value differently, which is measuring value at one point in time across many dimensions, but we've also considered the value chain when it comes to data. And this means that I can just get to some final takeaways, hopefully not too far off time. We can say this, we've got some valuations of data, £50 to £1,500, depending on what data you're looking at. But I don't think they're very meaningful, because the first principles are what matter for us, and I think particularly in this audience. The value of data is likely underestimated in most settings. So I think that 50 to 1,500 is a very conservative estimate of the value of the data in healthcare. And that's because we don't have the techniques to fully capture value, because I've just said we're looking at value in new ways, new dimensions. So there's a whole space there that we have to look forward into. But what we can say, if we go to these first principles that I wanted to get to, is that there's something proximal, which is that data only has value if conditions are created for the information to be produced. Thank goodness for openEHR, thank goodness for SNOMED and the WHO announcing a collaboration to increasingly harmonize the structures of the data, because that's a prerequisite to any value. Then at the distal end, my end, value assessment's evolving. How we actually measure value is a huge space for thinkers to move into, economists to move into. Actually, how we measure the results of all of this effort there's a lot more to do. Because more value dimensions are being considered, and we have to consider longer time horizons, given huge lags, the inherent lags, such as biobank data being curated since 2006, to the Hypermarker project. We have to consider these lags when we're valuing data today. So I can't answer all those questions now. I can't address all those dimensions of the problem now. But I wanted to just say that there's something about a prerequisite of having structured data that will feed forward into more sophisticated ways of assessing the value of the information that was produced. And we have to be preoccupied with these guiding principles as a group, I think, to advance our understanding of the value of data. Thanks for your time.